Welcome back. This would be our first introductory class where we will start with history from class 6. The first chapter that focuses on what, where, how and when. Now these four elements are those which we try to understand under the concept of history. Now let's take a simple example. We and our parents might be familiar with the means of transport, say aeroplane. Our grandparents might be familiar with the means of transport, let's say trains and buses, and our great grandfathers might be familiar with a means of transport which would be, let's say, bullock cart. So what has happened over the years? Over the years, the means of transport has evolved, and therefore in history whatever we study is basically the changes that take place with time. So we call it the chronological changes that takes place or the temporal changes that takes place. So all kinds of temporal variations, be it related to any place, any specific event, you have any specific culture or so on, would be a part and parcel of the concept of history. Now the first concept, as we said, we'll understand what. So when we say what, we focus on what kinds of clothes do you wear, what kind of houses are there, what kind of food is available. So all these come under the question what that we study under history. So what kind of food was taken by Harappan civilization, or what kind of food was grown by, let's say, Egyptian. So all this would come under what. We can also say in simple terms that those who don't study the past are condemned to repeat it. That means, let's say, why Britishers invaded India. If we are not aware of that, we might do the similar mistake and there could be a similar advent of some another country into our territory. So that's a kind of idea why we need to know the past so that we are aware of it and we do not repeat the similar mistakes in the future. So therefore, the first integral part of the historical concept is what. So we have all the basic essential amenities in our life which would be the part of what. Now where? The second important question. Now before we understand the second important question where, we have a simple code that helps us understand or gives us a much broader perspective on history that explains history is studied geographically and geography is studied historically. That means, let's first talk about geography. We have already covered the lectures on geography and we have seen how things evolved, how the origin of earth took place, how landforms evolved, how there were various continents that were formed. So what we are trying to do, we are trying to see how they formed, how they evolved, how people live. So what was the basic areas, how cultures evolved. So all those, the idea of how would come under the geography is studied historically because we are seeing the evolutionary patterns. And again when we talk about history, history is studied geographically because we must know where the major kingdoms were, where the wars were fought, what were the major trade centers in the country, what were the areas which were fertile. Again, we must be able to understand the areas which were bestowed with and which were deserted. So the areas which were bestowed with were the major centers for attraction and were the major centers for cultural development. The areas, let's say the desert area, has been isolated since long, so you have lesser kind of histories that would be found in these areas. So again, history is studied geographically. So once we know the geographical aspect, we can very well understand the history of that region and how things changed over that area. Now let's say in the area of Harappan civilization, we have civilizations of Kalibangan in Rajasthan, we have Lothal in Gujarat. So all these were the areas where in ancient time you had tributaries of Ganga that were flowing. So what was the major cause? This area was sometimes fertile and therefore you had a kind of a well bestowed civilization in that area. Now when we understand the concept of where, we will see where were the centers of food gatherers. So you have the tribal pockets or the forest pockets that were there. So those would be the areas of food gathering and hunting. Then you have the areas which were, let's say, the low hills of mountain region. So you would have the animal rearing practices that would be found. Then travel was an integral part of history as well as geography. Most of the islands and continents were discovered was a result of travel, and that we study under geography. But again, travel led to expansion of many kingdoms. So you have the Ashtamedh Yagna that was performed, that was the horse riding into the territory, and wherever it ran, you have the whole territory that was acquired. So all those kind of events. Then you have Alexander who came from Greece and invaded India. So you have all those invasions that were result of the travel. So again, travel is integral part of history. Then, as we said, where the major wars were located, where the major wars took place, where the major kingdoms were located. So let's say you have the Ganga river that flows here, you have the Jhelum river and the tributaries of Indus that you have here. So the region surrounding the Ganga river, you had the Magad kingdom, and Magad kingdom was one of the largest traditional kingdoms of that time. Again, you have Indus Valley, which was nearly 4,700 years ago. So you have Indus Valley civilization, which was that old. Then you have Ganga civilization, or the regions close to Ganga that developed around 2,500 years ago. So you have different time periods where evolution, where civilization took place in the various areas. So that's what we study under where. The next is the names of India. So India is derived from the word Sindhu, which is a Sanskrit word. When Iranians and Greeks invaded India, they called India as Hindus or Indos. And finally, the name Bharat comes from Rig Veda. So the people in the northwest who read Rig Veda considered this region as Bharata. Now the next important question is how. So we have understood what, where. The next important question comes how. How can we find out what was in the ancient times? So there are three basic things that we go for. The first is the manuscripts, that is the documents which are written by hand. Now to decipher the manuscripts, the first important thing is you must be aware of that script. So let's say in Egypt, the Rosetta area, you had three languages which ran simultaneously. One was Greek and two other were Egyptians. Now in that language you had El, that means lion. So you have to decipher what kind of language it is, and these manuscripts in ancient times were written either on the bark of the birch tree or on the palm leaves, and these palm leaves were tied together. Most common languages in the Indian peninsula when we see was the Sanskrit, Prakrit and Tamil. So most of the manuscripts you would find either in Sanskrit, Prakrit or Tamil. Now Sanskrit was the language of the scholarly. Prakrit was considered as a language of common man at that time. The next is inscriptions. The inscriptions are those which are engravements on the hard surface. So it can be stone, it can be metal, it can be a baked clay. So all kind of inscriptions that were seen were writings on the hard surface, and these writings were again in form of some scripts. This script could be either letters or signs that were used. And finally is archaeology. So archaeology is things that were made and used in the past. So let's say if you are digging something and you find a kind of small pot or a piece of rock, you can decipher what kind of utensils the people used to use, what kind of living styles they had, what kind of bathing area, what kind of living area they had. So all these are explored by archaeologists. So archaeologists are the people who mainly excavate the areas and find out the results based on those. Again, bones of the animals are important idea to find what people ate, and this is again what is studied under archaeology. So how is another important question. Now the life, from the ancient time has differed for various segments of the people. The life of the king was different from a tradesman, a trader's life was different from a life of a farmer. So you had the different segments of life that has been studied for each and every civilization. So you have, for every civilization you will see how kings and queens used to live, how the common man and the merchants used to live, and how the farmers and the people who were engaged in primary activity used to live. Again, there were demarcations based on the availability, as we said. So geography, history is studied geographically. So based on the availability of resources, let's say the people in Andaman were self-sufficient because they were producing their own food and using it. However, at that time also the people in the cities were dependent on the rural areas in terms of food supply. So you had kind of regions that were developed, and there was geographical isolation that happened. And finally, the last important is when. So whenever we talk about history, most of you would say we have to learn only which war was held when. So it's not about that, but yes, that is an integral part. So when we say when, we usually try to understand it with the birth of Jesus. So prior to the birth of Jesus and after the birth of Jesus. So when we say it's after the birth of Jesus, we say it as AD. AD is also known as CE or Common Era. AD means Anno Domini, and before the birth of Jesus we call it BC or before Christ. Before Christ is also known as BCE, that is before the Common Era. So we say Common Era and before the Common Era, and we sometimes also use the term BP, that is before present. So these are some of the common terms that we use when we talk about when. When is again important because we need to know and we learn to know how things had happened over the years and how the scenario has changed. So this was a kind of pure introduction to understand the concept of history. We will be dealing with the real chapters as we move forward with the history and the further classes. You can subscribe to our channel for more updates on NCERTs and current affairs. Have a good day ahead.